Hello everyone and welcome to All Things Watched. In this video we are going to talk about Season 2 of Loki, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the theories going around, and we're just going to give a general review of the series. It won't be a full-blown spoiler review, but we will hint and touch at some things. Nothing too crazy, but like I said, I am going to be doing a spoiler review as well, so if you want to check that out, go check it out. I usually do these spoiler reviews on the podcast, so it'll probably be like an hour-long conversation of everything that we think is happening from the beginning of Season 2 right to the end. Where do we think the future of the MCU and the future of Kang and also Loki goes from here, and all that good stuff. But for the sake of this review, we'll just keep it relatively short and relatively simple. So in this review, this season picks up with episode 1, which was titled Ouroboros, and that word alone, Ouroboros, sort of is sort of the theme for the entire season, and even for the entire series for that matter, because this season does a really good job at tying in with Season 1 as well. And quite frankly, you could almost say that the whole Multiverse Saga in general really revolves around that Ouroboros feeling, that whole snake eating its own tail, that chicken and egg sort of thing. What came first, the chicken or the egg, and that sort of thing. And this season does a really good job at playing that. So in the first episode, the first time we see Loki, it takes up and picks up right where Season 1 left off, with Sylvie killing He Who Remains. And as soon as she killed He Who Remains, she ends up kicking Loki through a time door, through this time portal, and that's exactly where this season picks up. It picks up with Loki now being sent through that time portal, and he gets up, and when he looks around, he notices that at the TVA there's these giant Kang statues, and there's all these things that resembles Kang. And then when he finally sees Mobius, Mobius does not recognize who he is. Now at first glance, you might think, that, or at least if you only judge it on Season 1, you might think that maybe by killing He Who Remains, they actually altered the timeline. But it turns out that that is not the case, because in the first episode we learn that Loki now has a problem, which is that he is time slipping. Now, right from the very get-go, literally from the very first review, you can even go back and look at my review and look at the uploading date and whatnot. I have always said right from day one that I believe that He Who Remains is very much still in control. And quite frankly, even after this season, even after the finale of this season, I still believe that He Who Remains, or a version of He Who Remains, or Kang the Conqueror, is still very much in control. But we'll get into that a little bit here, but we'll really get into that into the spoiler review when I talk about a little bit about the comics, but also a little bit why I think He Who Remains is still very much in control. So the first episode sees Loki time slipping, and basically that entire first episode is all about trying to figure out how to stop Loki from time slipping and basically make him stable, basically give Loki some stability so that he's not jumping through time and going in and out of time. And even that, and of course in this season and in that episode, we are introduced to a character whose name is actually Ouroboros, and they call him OB for short. So I also thought that that was very clever on the writing, to actually not only have all of the Multiverse Saga and all of the series of Loki sort of be that Ouroboros series, but also to actually incorporate a character named Ouroboros who also lives a life that is sort of like an Ouroboros, if that makes sense, as you get because once you get further into the season, you learn that he, or OB is the one that ended up writing the TVA book. And of course, when you get to episode 4, you learn a little bit more and whatnot. So the first episode is all about Loki, and he has to basically find his stability in the timeline, and that's essentially what the first episode is, and that takes place right after where Season 1 ends. So then in the next episode, then Loki wants to try to figure out some more answers, and the only way that he knows how to find these answers is by talking to Sylvie, because she too was at the end of time in the Citadel, and he needs to know what happened after she has killed He Who Remains. So in order to do this, the TVA ends up having to go and find one of their agents who is basically hiding out on one of their branch timelines, and he is calling himself Brad. And that is essentially what all the second episode is about, is all about them having to find Brad. And then once they find Brad ends up leading them to Sylvie, and we end up learning that the TVA is still pruning timelines, and so now it becomes a question of morality. All these timelines has trillions and billions of different lives and actual souls. And so we realize that by Kang pruning these timelines, he's not just, getting rid of timelines in the sense, he's not just destroying alternate realities, but he's destroying all these lives as well. And that's something that season 2 has done a really good job with, especially Sylvie. From Sylvie's perspective, she does a really good job. Sylvie's almost like the heart of this series. She's the one that is really, I would say, the most grounded in reality, in the sense that she's really the one that's, Loki is sort of, more looking at it more like a double-edged sword. It's like, yes, a lot of bad things are happening, but at the same time, if we don't destroy some small amounts of people, then nobody would survive. So then Sylvie's perspective is like, well, okay, I understand that, but who gets to decide who lives and who gets to decide who's bad? And they're really playing that really heavy into this season, and I think it really works. And of course, Tom Hiddleston and the actor that plays Sylvie just does an absolute phenomenal job at really making that sink in. Sophia Di Martino, who plays Sylvie, their chemistry and dynamic on screen really does a good job, and it really, it really plays into the heart they really tug at the heartstrings. So of course, then by the time we get to episode 3, which is basically the mid-season finale, we're finally introduced to another Kang variant who's known as Victor Timely. Now, of course, Victor Timely's story sort of changes a little bit by the time we get to the end of the series as well. But it's very important that they find him, because we learn that at the end of time, after Sylvie ends up killing He Who Remains, this, what they call this temporal loom, or this oral loom, which is sort of holding together the sacred timeline, is now becoming overloaded with all these branch timelines, and there's no way that they can stop it unless they have the aura, or the DNA, so to speak, or the aura of He Who Remains. So in order for them to get that, they have to find a variant, and of course that variant comes in the form of Victor Timely, which is all about what episode 3 was about. And then when we get to episode 4, which was titled Heart of the TVA, which really is very symbolic as well, referring to the temporal loom itself and all that kind of stuff. Then episode 4 really ends with a big bang, literally with the loom sort of blowing up, and then they have to they don't really know what to do from there. They try a bunch of stuff and nothing really works, and then of course, that big event happens in episode 4. The loom blows up, even with the help of OB and the help of Timely. Loki is just not able to save the day. So then, as we approached into the third act of the season, episode 5 and 6, episode 5 was titled Science Fiction, and in this episode, Loki ends up once again going back into time slipping. So now, once again, and it's also very important to acknowledge as well, in episode 4 is pretty well where episode 1 picks up. So you can basically say that episode 1 and episode 4 happens around the same time, even though they're outside of time, if that makes sense. And then episode 2 and 3 is sort of filling in the gaps, and then we start to go into that Ouroboros, sort of that loop, that time loop, sort of, the snake eating its own tail, which is very prominent and very heavy in this season, and also in season 1 by the time you see the end of this one, because they do a really good job of going back to season 1, and they just do a great job with that. So then episode 5 comes, which was titled Science Fiction, and this is very much like an origin story of the TVA, and you start to learn a little bit about, all the agents of the TVA. You learn a little bit about their backstories, where they came from, where were they at in life when Kang sort of took them out of their reality, or maybe somebody else took them out of their reality. You'll have to watch the episode to see. I don't want to totally ruin it for you, but you get what I'm saying. You learn in episode 5 that reality is not really what it seems, which then leads into the 6th and final episode, which was actually titled Glorious Purpose, which was the exact same name of episode 1 from the first season. Once again, playing into that Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail, which came first, episode 1, episode 6, you get what I'm saying? It's really like this loop, and because by the time we get to the end of episode 6, Loki once again is then faced with He Who Remains, but it's the same He Who Remains from season 1, and so they do a really good job at sort of keeping you in this time loop, really making you wonder and question, was all of this a part of Kang's plan right from the very get-go. Did Kang always know that Loki would end up going into this time loop? Was it always Kang's plan for this, temporal loom to explode, which would sort of have some consequences all within itself? He does say in episode 6, so I guess like a little minor spoiler, but not really anything that would fully ruin the show for you. But he does say in episode 6 that in season 1 he said that if he died, then all the variants would come and there would be this big multiversal war. But then in season 2, in episode 6, he then says, he doesn't just really say if he died there would be a multiversal war. He then sort of changes it a little bit and says if the temporal loom explodes or no longer exists, then there will be a multiversal war. So he changes the story a little bit, but it's still the same idea. So in season 1 he says if he dies, season 2 he says if the temporal loom dies. Now there's a lot of people that I've seen online that claims that by the end of this season Loki has now become the god of stories, which once again is sort of a minor spoiler, but it's only a spoiler to people I think that really know comic books. If you're not someone who actually reads the comics, then you're not really going to know what that means, and I'm not going to go into that too heavy here, but I will go into it heavier in my spoiler review and why I believe that Loki is not the god of stories. And not only is he not the god of stories, but he's not even as powerful as what a lot of people are saying he is, while at the same time he is, if that makes sense. You see, in the comics, the god of stories is pretty well the most powerful being that exists in the MCU. There's probably only one, maybe two characters that are more powerful than Loki once he becomes the god of stories, and believe me, Kang is not one of them. So I can guarantee you that Loki is not the god of stories right now. Not only that, but every time Loki tries to change something in season 2, especially in episode 5, or even 6, episode 5 and 6, every time Loki tries to change something and have a different outcome, it's almost like nothing ever works. Now, if he was the god of stories, it absolutely would work. That's what his ability is in the comics as the god of stories. He literally can rewrite the story. He can just make it so that Kang doesn't even exist. He can make it so that the multiverse doesn't exist. He can literally do whatever he wants. He would basically be God if he was the god of stories. But he's not in this case because he fails over and over and over. He's not able to change stuff. So instead, there'd be sort of a different outcome. Now, I think that the furthest you could go with Loki in this one in terms of power is you might be able to say he's the god of time, but even that I don't think he's fully, because he still doesn't really have the ability to truly change time itself. He just has the ability to move in and out of time. So I still don't know that you would necessarily say that he's the god of time. Like, I would think that his abilities with time right now is probably the same as Kang. So I would say right now Loki is probably, equivalent to one version of Kang, but probably not even the strongest version of Kang, but still very powerful nonetheless. But he's definitely not the god of stories. So if you hear someone saying that Loki is now the god of stories, he's not. He's not even half as powerful as the god of stories. And really, even with how this one ends, I would say that, because I've seen a lot of people talking about, this is sort of a spoiler too, but sort of talking about how Loki is now empowering and sort of, he's become the multiverse itself. He's creating all this life. But I wouldn't agree with that totally. I would say that the multiverse simply requires energy to survive, just like a Big Bang or something like that. It requires a massive amount of energy. And before Loki and before the loom exploded, it's like Kang's technology, or the loom itself, is what empowered the multiverse, so to speak. But now I would say that it's Loki's magic that's empowering the multiverse. But it's still not because he's super powerful or because he has the ability to create. I would just say it's because of his magic. And that's what I think is happening at the end of this episode. So I don't believe that Loki literally has the power to actually create or destroy universes in that sense, but I do think that he is just simply using the magic. The multiverse is sort of wielding his magic, and his magic is becoming that energy that is required to sustain life. But I don't think it's in the sense that he's like this god now that can actually create and destroy. I just think that he's physically empowering the multiverse, and I would even go as far as saying that I don't even think that he's actually, I don't believe that it actually looks like that in the way that we've seen, because Loki would now become four-dimensional. Because you oftentimes hear people online say, well, how come like time is physical? How can he actually grab time? Well, that's because he's in a place outside of time. So Loki is more four-dimensional, whereas time is a part of, you know, three-dimensional, time, space, and matter, so to speak. So I would say that that's how Loki is able to actually physically touch them, is because he's outside of it. He becomes this four-dimensional character, and everything that we've seen in the MCU is inside of those strands that he is now empowering. So now, you know, so in terms of what does this mean for Secret Wars, and what does this mean for the future of both Loki and He Who Remains, or Kang, and everything that's going to come with the Kang Dynasty in the future, then I would say I'm not going to talk about that here, but if you want to know my thoughts and opinions, then definitely check out the podcast over on Spotify, where I'll be doing the full open spoiler conversation, and you guys can go and check that out. If I had to put a number on Loki, I would give this one a 90%, because I don't think any project is actually perfect, but I do think that this is the closest thing to being perfect is what we could have possibly have gotten for a Loki season 2, or for Loki in general. I think this series is definitely one of the strongest things Marvel has done, probably ever, and I cannot wait to see where Loki's story goes from here. Like I said, check out the podcast if you want to know my thoughts, my theories as to where I think this leads in to Kang and to the Multiversal War, and where, and plus we'll break down the series, you know, episode by episode a little bit, and we'll really dive into it. We'll talk about the relationship between Kang here, or He Who Remains, and then also Kang the Conqueror from Ant-Man. We'll talk about how that ties in to the Marvels, which just came out. There's a scene in the movie, in the Marvels, where the three Marvels are trying to save the Skrull colony, but they're not able to save everybody. And there's actually a line that Captain Marvel says that's very reminiscent to what Kang says, or He Who Remains says. Captain Marvel says, "We can't save everybody, so let's just save who we can," which is sort of, you know, reminiscence to Loki and pruning of the timelines. You know, they're willing to sacrifice some timelines to TVA, but they're not willing for the greater good. You know, not everybody can make it, but we can save who we can, so to speak. So I thought that was a really cool parallel between Loki and the Marvels. And also the Marvels has an incursion, and we really see the reality and different universes starting to collide. But anyways, folks, that's my review of Loki Season 2. If you like this video, click that subscribe button. Let me know your thoughts and opinions down in the comment section below. If you want to help the channel grow, like, share, comment, all that good stuff, help the algorithm. And that's pretty well all I got. So until the next video, take care.